Welcome to Tea Talks Unfiltered, the podcast where we drink tea, we talk, and they're both unfiltered. My name is Jake, and I will be your host. And on today's episode, we are going to be drinking tea, and we're going to be discussing tea. All right. More specifically, we're going to be drinking a white tea, actually Lao Bai Cha, which means old white tea, from Fujian province. This was a gift from a student during the summer. I finally opened it up and I've been drinking it all day, and it's excellent. Definitely white tea is one of my favorite kind of types of tea on average. But I like everything, but I think I'm partial to white teas. And we're going to be discussing tea. Actually, I'm also really excited about this. It's my first question from the audience, from you guys, that I'm going to answer in episode format. So you guys are more than welcome to ask questions during the YouTube comments. You can send me a DM or on social media. Or if you're on Discord, you can send me questions directly there. And we often discuss on Discord or on the different platforms. But like today's question, occasionally I can also make an episode out of it and kind of go more into detail. So thank you, you guys, for kind of being there and keeping the conversation going. And today we're going to be answering one of those questions. And I think it's a really important topic because tea, obviously, is very central to this project, to these episodes, to this experience. And I think it's a good subject for us to delve into and kind of explain a little bit more, okay? So today's question is actually going to be coming from, sorry if I get this name wrong, but I'm going to do my best, Lucas Raskowski. And he says, 非常喜欢, maybe you can talk a little more about tea culture, kinds of tea, how to start the tea drinking adventure, where online you can buy tea, kinds of brewing, things like this, etc. So thank you, Lucas. This is going to be the answer to that question. And I hope you can enjoy just give you a little bit more information, a little more background, share some stories, and kind of hopefully give you more insight into the culture of tea, how it's influential not just to me and this project, but also in Chinese culture, in our practices. Hopefully you can bring a little bit of that into your own ceremony, into your own tea experience. So thank you for that. Ganbei. Yeah. Very good white tea. Like I said, I'm going to be drinking this for a while. It comes in a big disc, a big cake, basically. And I'm going to be breaking pieces off of white tea and drinking that quite exclusively, I think, for the next couple weeks. So, but yeah, let's get into it. Yeah, a whole episode dedicated to tea. We got a lot of cool stuff to talk about. Types of tea, preparation, ceremony, Gongfu cha, chadao, the utensils, the pieces, the types, the flavors, some philosophy, I hope. So a bunch of stuff to go over, but it is really important to start very generally. I don't think I'll be able to explain everything, of course, because tea itself is a huge subject. It is one of the essential parts of Chinese culture. It is definitely recognized as a heritage. It's recognized as a trade, a currency at times in history. During the Silk Road, there are so many aspects to tea historically, in the different flavors in the market, the different brands, the different lineages that, prepare tea, that it is way too much information for me to cover in one episode. And not that I would be professional enough to go into all the fine details, but I think I can give you a pretty good general outlook and give you some good insight, ways to connect it, and hopefully answer these questions and give you some ideas like where to start, what to look for. Yeah, I think we'll touch on everything. So to zoom out, and at the beginning we have to say, what is tea? Okay. And this is actually kind of important because all tea actually comes from a specific species of tree, kind of a shrub, more likely in the types that are pruned, but it can grow very, very large as well if it's wild. That tree, the Latin name is Camellia sinensis. There's also another variety, Assamica. Not exactly sure if I'm looking that up, but you can see that online. Probably there's a Wikipedia, lots of information, of course. All tea, despite whatever kind of type, brand, flavor, originates from this species of tree, right? There are many different, maybe strands, like you could actually trace the ancestry of the trees to a specific location, typically in the mountains, in more tropical type climates in China. So Fujian, Anhui, Yunnan, to name a few. There are a few more now, because of course tea plantations are very widely popular, and a very big part of the modern market, historically as well. But these trees like lots of sunlight and lots of rain, and so in those kind of climates in the mountains, they kind of grow really, really well. There are a lot of variety within those trees themselves, but the way the tea leaves, they are either partially budded, fully kind of bloomed. The way they are harvested, the time of year, the location, the way they are prepared, pan-fried, roasted, tumbled, air-dried, manufactured processes like that as well, more traditionally, more accelerated. All of that factors in to the type of tea, right? So you have your basic different flavors, I guess. You have your greens, your whites, your yellows, reds, blacks, pu'er, and oolong, or Oolong Cha, depending on how you want to describe that. Those all come from the same leaves, essentially, right? Maybe different parts of the plant, different types of the year, all these factor in, right? When we look at those different types, you're probably pretty familiar with some of them, but we should describe them in the Chinese terms, because there are some distinctions that are difficult, because they're not universally recognized the same way. When we're talking about blacks and reds, for example, those kinds of teas, sometimes they have different meanings in Europe or in India versus in China. So we have to kind of explain the difference between the different types. But to start at the beginning, we should mention green tea. Green tea is probably the easiest place to start. Green tea is definitely in China. It is the most popular form of tea, the most widely drank on every occasion. I know when I first came to China, and even now, I think it's slowed down a little bit more recently in favor of other types of tea. But because green tea is readily available, it's relatively easy to produce compared to some like pu'er that can be very, very demanding for the process of preparation. Green tea is only partially oxidized, which basically means it's only partially fermented. So it's a shorter time. It can be done. There's types that are done in full sunlight dried. There's some that are shaded and dried. That affects the kind of flavor, the way the leaves are oxidized. They don't require as much fine preparation and pruning. It can be done a little bit, I suppose, a little bit lighter. That's not necessarily guaranteed, but it's a little bit lighter of a workload, and so it can be more readily available. It's also very popular, and so you'll often have it paired with meals at restaurants and things like that. Like the guarantee here, whereas in the West, maybe you'll have lemon water or ice water. It's that guarantee at the dinner table. In a restaurant, here it is definitely a pot of hot water and green tea. That is like the staple everywhere you go. It is a very bitter taste, and that's kind of widely sought after in China. There's quite a lot of bitter foods that are really, really popular, and so this drink pairs with that, and kind of it's that kind of stimulant, right? It's kind of the Eastern version of coffee. It's like your basic necessity. Green tea, very, very popular, very, very easy to find, very common. Okay. From there, we can talk about your white teas. The white teas, the very delicious ones, I think. These ones are typically, of course, you can talk about just the coloration. So if you say green, white, and dark, the basic distinction is just the color, right? White has a brighter color. It also has a softer taste, so it's not typically as bitter. It's not as strong or as pungent. It can have a pretty, I think, it can have a very widespread kind of taste from one white to another. White is actually really hard to describe specifically, whereas like green tea is more established as exactly what it is, what it takes to produce green tea. A white tea, because it's something lightly processed, that could mean the leaves are very young. So in some cases they're pruned maybe before they're fully open, but when they're still kind of budding. Maybe it's the youngest leaf on the tree. The youngest leaves, they're taken off, and those are used to process. They're handled very softly and delicately. So when the leaves bruise, what happens, the leaves bruise, and that actually releases a lot of the enzymes in the leaves. And that's what causes the beginning of that oxidation, of that fermentation. So white tea is actually sometimes very, very softly pruned, very, very delicate throughout the process, barely fermented, barely gone through this kind of process. So it's just a very subtle taste. But because of that, it carries a lot of the natural kind of undertones of that tree, of that strand, of that location in a way. I feel like white tea has a tendency of feeling more natural, but not overpowering, right? But there's many ways they can accomplish that. You know, it could be that they're dried and they're hand rolled, or they're kind of tumbled very softly. They're not really going to go through those manufactured processes of roasting and things like this, where you're going to really damage the leaf during that drying process, right? So very lightly processed, very lightly kind of prepared. The white actually refers to the hairs on those young leaves. So when you actually get this tea, if it's pressed into a cake or if it's loose leaf, however, when you get it, you might actually see kind of a fuzz on it. And that kind of gives the distinction of white tea, is that, you know, it has that kind of really kind of almost premature, pre-ripe type texture to it. And also that carries over in the taste, right? White tea, really, really great. I've heard there's some really, really great stories. I assume some of them are probably based in truth, but one of the ones that really stuck with me was the white tea is kind of the emperor's tea. It's kind of the richest, because it's the most difficult to produce traditionally. You know, everything has to be very delicate. Everything has to be very easily done, kind of all by hand. And so in that way, you can't rush the process. It has to be done to a certain standard, and it has to be done very kind of, not meditatively, but in a sense, like it has to be done very consciously. It can't just be everything thrown into a bag and shipped over here and shooken around. It has to be very kind of well taken care of throughout the entire preparation. So one of the stories that I still remember, and it's a good imagery to kind of think about the distinction of the process for white tea, is that the emperor's tea, the kind of king white tea, is only picked by hand, and even more specifically picked by mouth, by only the lips of beautiful women. And so the idea was that these women were kind of going through the tea plantations and picking the softest leaves, only using their lips. So even their fingers don't ever smash the leaves. It's always this super delicate process. Now, I'm not sure. I don't know the history of it well enough to say if that's an absolutely true story, or if it was really done, or if it's even still done. Because I know that there are lots of techniques of pruning and the process and the kind of tradition tied up in that. You can buy a cake of white tea for, you know, under 100 kwai up to thousands of kwai. So it's very possible, but there's also quite a lot of also like competitive capitalism in there as well. So you got to be careful when you start buying tea, because it can be a cash hole. It can be something that you are just, you know, really investing in, because there's so much variety, there's so much history, and it's very hard for you to have the final product and be able to really be able to taste, you know, that distinction, where it could just be a marketing ploy. So there is some of that, which we'll get to as well. But in general, you think of that idea of the white tea kind of being this most delicately prepared tea. That kind of gives you the idea of the kind of taste that you're looking for there. Is that very subtle, right? Very subtle and soft. It also has the least amount of caffeine. I should mention that. I wrote that down as a bullet point. We also have yellow tea. Yellow tea isn't so well known. It's really just a rarer form of green tea. So something maybe between white and green that is very subtle and very, very, very sweet to taste. And so that can be pretty rare and pretty expensive. So I don't know if I'd really see a tea that's specified as yellow. You'd probably just see a very high quality green tea. And that would be a yellow tea technically, right? So kind of just a more subtle, more rich kind of version of green tea, right? Then we get into your oolong. Okay, oolong tea is also one of my favorites. When I first came to China, that was definitely the go-to because it's a little bit more readily available with good quality, rather than if you're trying to look for a really good quality white tea, that can get pretty expensive, especially if you're kind of going for those well-known, established brands and names. Oolong tea or Oolong cha, your dark dragon tea, is produced a little bit more oxidation than green tea. So it goes through a process of withering the plant with very, very strong sunlight. So it's dried in this kind of like beating sunlight. And then that is done before it is curled and twisted together, which can be kind of done by hand. It can also be done through kind of roller machines that are slightly heated. Lots of different ways for that process. You'll typically have oolong tea. Sorry, I gotta get some more of this before it cools off. You'll typically have oolong tea prepared in like little balls with tails, or some kind of way that's kind of like rolled up on itself in these little beads. That way, when you steep it, it actually opens up slowly throughout the different steeps into the full leaf. You can see, well, I don't know if you can see my white tea. You probably can't see it through the camera, but my white tea is almost full leaves. Like it's really not broken down. You can tell it's been just kind of dried and stored, and even the cake itself is kind of loose. That's kind of like oolong, but oolong will be a little bit more rolled together. There's a little bit more oxidation, a little bit more fermentation happening there, which gives it a much more earthy, kind of rich taste to it, really thick, dark taste, but not so much caffeine or strong as like a red or a black, right? So that can be a really nice go-to with the oolong tea. It's really, really popular for people who do tea ceremonies and things like Gongfu cha and chadao, because it can be steeped many, many times. It can be used, over and over, and each steep, each pour can get a little bit different of a flavor. Maybe you'll start off with a bitter taste. It'll get a little bit stronger and thicker, and then it'll also have another taste as it goes on, right? It'll have another subtle, like a more subtle undertone that comes through. So that's something that you'll notice with the tea ceremony, is that tea is something that's meant to be steeped multiple times. It's meant to be poured and drank with like emphasis on recognizing those differences, with kind of like enjoying the journey of each serving of tea, right? Of course, like with green teas, because they're so much readily available and they're so much more widely drank, sometimes you'll just have the glass thermos that just has not a bag, but loose leaf tea inside, and it's just steeped all day. And so that gets really, really strong. And again, that's why it's probably more like a green tea that would do that, because you don't want something like white tea or oolong tea to steep for too long. One, you kind of damage the tea, and you kind of overpower the drink. In the case of an oolong tea, you might steep for a really long time, and if that's not your preference, that could just get really, really strong, and it'd be kind of overtaken. All those warm textures would be overtaken by more bitterness and just kind of overpowering. But with those successive pours, over and over, those can kind of take you on a different journey, right? So oolong tea, definitely a very big variety. Some of them are rolled longer. Some of them are rolled in those little dragon tails, the little pearl ball with the tail hanging off. So you'll see those, they almost look like little buds, and those are really nice. I think when I first came to Wudang, I had my first tea ceremony on Wudang Mountain at Taizipo, which is the Prince Temple. It's like the first stop when you're heading up the mountain. Really beautiful place. And in the back of the 9, what is it called? The 9-tiered temple. There's the construction type. There's like one pillar that supports the entire temple. And right in that area, they have the tea ceremony kind of room where you can have tea. You can also buy tea that's grown locally now. And I had my first tea ceremony there. And one of the first teas that I had was an oolong. And I bought a lot of it. And I never knew the name of it. I knew it was oolong, but I didn't really know much information about it. We would always just call it the ball tea because it was the little beads. And that was the kind of tea that you would just drink all day. You'd pour it in the morning and you just keep re-pouring it until the end of the day, and occasionally into the next day too, because it has a much more long-lasting kind of thicker taste to it. And so that one really stuck with me because it wasn't so much caffeine or kind of overbearing bitterness that you couldn't drink it all day. It was really something that was like very sweet almost. So that was one of my favorites. And now they have a different variety that they're growing, and they don't have that exact same oolong anymore. But that oolong was very nice. Really, really good for tea ceremony, but also just for individual drinking at home. So that's oolong. Now we get into the reds and the blacks. Okay, so here's where we get a little bit different. We have to kind of specify your red tea in China is what most of the world refers to as black tea, right? So you're kind of like longer fermented tea than what we've mentioned so far. Very strong taste. The kind of flavor that lasts a lot longer in storage. And so it's one of those ones that, when you produce it, it can last longer. It has a longer shelf life, I guess you could say. Whereas like a green tea is kind of like a seasonal, white tea, it'll probably last a little while, but you want to have more ones that are stored very well to maintain that good taste. Whereas when you get into these reds and these blacks, you're getting into something that's going to be like a little bit easier to store and handle because the fermenting process kind of withholds or maintains such a stronger taste, and maybe even ages better. Like it'll actually get better with age. And so this is when you're starting to get into the tea that will have timestamps, which you might get with the other ones, fair. But here it's almost like the prerequisite. You will get something that has a date and time and year and location. And you get into these very strong dark teas. Also, when you get into these, historically in China, these darker teas are what would be used as tribute or payment in lots of cases because of their easily kind of way to transport them, the amount of demand that was also there between different nations. You talk about the Silk Road, you talk about history, you can't get away from the type of emphasis placed on spice and placed on herbs and placed on tea in Asia. And so that became kind of a currency in lots of cases. And once you start getting into those kind of bricks, once you start getting into compressing tea, which can be done a few different ways to kind of maintain the potential of the tea quality. Once you get into this kind of process with these darker teas, that it's now possible to do this, that's very, very quickly becomes, instead of giving you so many taels of gold, we'll give you so many pounds of tea, kilos of tea. And you can transport that a little bit easier, and it has an instant turnover, has an instant kind of trade value, right? Even to where historically in China, there were periods where that would become the preferred currency as demanded by emperors or officials. That becomes kind of the main staple. It's like kind of trading for food. You're trading for tea, you're trading for rice, trading for oil, you're trading for salt and ginger, these kinds of things, these necessities of China, right? So these red teas, that's what we mean when we talk about like a European black tea. That would be considered a red tea here. Okay. That is just because now when we get into black tea, what we normally refer to there is we're just going to specify pu'er. Okay. Now pu'er, the name can be attributed to its kind of location. and that kind of there's a location that shares the same name. But that tea is what you're thinking of when you see those bricks or cakes or the bing. Okay, so you've got the discs. That's the typical version here. And you have two different types. You have fermented tea that is raw, or the sheng pu'er, or the shou pu'er, which is ripe. So sheng, which is your raw, and shou, which is ripe. Shou literally translates to fully cooked, and sometimes that gets interpreted incorrectly as something that goes through some kind of always goes through a roasting or some kind of pan frying process, which it may, but it doesn't necessarily have to. So you can see there's a little bit of confusion there if you translate it directly. It's better just to kind of understand it as your sheng pu'er being something that is done in that long scale traditional process of preparation that goes through many more steps, and that shou pu'er is something that is typically, not always, but typically through some more manufactured, kind of a modern way of doing that same thing, but doing it in a kind of accelerated process, right? And so there is like a quality difference there because of that, the microbial kind of oxidation that happens with a sheng pu'er that creates a more balanced flavor in some cases, but it also might be full of variety, where it's a little bit less controllable. Whereas a shou pu'er is going to be more modern, more kind of a sophisticated process that delivers consistent results more often, right? So that's probably the easiest way to understand it. Pu'er is the only truly fully fermented tea. There's lots of teas that kind of claim that, but the way the process is done, pu'er is the only one that actually has that natural enzyme release that creates that oxidation, that creates that fermentation. Also, often other times it's stimulated through a different kind of practice. So, it's almost not additive, but it's in this way, it's secondary to the tea plant, whereas pu'er is naturally occurring. It's letting the process play out, right? They're dried, they're rolled, and then they're fermented. They can be put in different cakes. You have lots of different ways of receiving pu'er, or even some whites, things like that. But you'll typically have, the most popular is the bing, or the discs. You have these big circles, these big flat kind of plates that'll be presented in many different ways, designed, maybe even have kind of imprints on them in some cases. You have your bricks, which are your classic, just solid bricks, which are a lot more dense and probably the more popular form of travel in history. And then you have your squares that can be broken off, maybe a little bit thinner. You have your smaller discs. You have mushrooms, which are kind of cool. And don't see as many of those. Maybe you'll see the nest or the bowl, which is kind of the same thing, but the disc has an imprint, and so it has kind of a hollowed out area. Sometimes even there'll be a string compressed in there to handle it a little bit easier. So as you're using the pu'er, you would have this knife that you would kind of find in the crevices and split the pu'er tea, so that way you're not using your hand and breaking it, because the idea is there that you're damaging the leaves and kind of ripping it open, and you're damaging that process. You want to maintain the integrity of that fermentation of the leaves themselves, and so you would use a special knife to kind of break off small sections and then steep that, and it would naturally kind of spread apart, and that preserves the kind of integrity of the cake, because that one cake is going to last you a while. You're gonna take small pieces and you're gonna store it wrapped up in boxes in plastic, depending on how diligent you are, I suppose, and how quickly you drink the whole thing. But then you would have that out for a short amount of time, break off your piece, wrap it back up, and then you would drink that one piece until it was done and reserve, right? And so pu'er, very, 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 very popular. Probably historically why the other teas are more prevalent and popular today, because of the preparation process being easier, being a little bit less labor inducive, because already a tea plantation is a lot of work, right? If you have a wild tree, that is maybe the most sought after, but because of the difficulty of harvesting a tree that's much taller, 10 meters high, and the inconsistency of it, the hard hardship it takes to get to that tree because it's fully in the wild in nature, and finding it and processing it and doing everything else on top of that, that can be quite intense as far as a workload. Whereas some of the other teas can be manufactured, they can be pruned trees on farmland. They can be a lot more readily available, and you can have a more streamlined process of workers to create that product. But today, with the growth of the tea market and with manufacturing processes available, and this, the kind of history of tea being such that everything has been not figured out, but everything has kind of found its pattern, and there are kind of like directions and staples that we produce. Pu'er, Pu'er is a lot easier to come by. That's also to say there is everything from cheap to extravagantly expensive types of pu'er, but it is a little more readily available today. So I think that a lot of people are becoming more partial to a pu'er, especially because if you are a avid tea drinker, if you are commonly finding yourself at these tables, then pu'er tea is a lot more taste, potential, variety, but not as much kind of bitterness or caffeine or, maybe these kind of intense aspects of tea like drinking tea regularly, right? I was always told that, you don't want to drink too much green tea. You don't want to drink too much black or too much red. Sorry. You don't want to drink too much of these because they're so kind of aggressive in one sense that you can kind of overdo it, right? The idea with kidney stones is with too much kidney stones, all that bitterness has an aspect of it that has more kind of fire producing in the body. And I don't know where I've read this, but I've read something about it being linked to on a small scale the elimination of kidney stones, but on a large scale maybe the potential like growth of more kidney stones, right? Because it's a little bit more impactful on the kidneys, a little bit more impactful on the blood. So drinking green tea, drinking red tea, sometimes can be very hard on the liver because if you drink all the time, it can kind of influence the body. But with a pu'er, with a show pu'er, with some of these whites, they're a little bit more subtle. That fermentation process kind of assists in the digestion and the absorption of it. It's more cleansing in that sense, to where it's a lot harder to overdo, hopefully. And don't quote me on that. Of course, there's so much information on that. There's so much variety on tea types that, it's very hard to lock down one answer because, of the variety within each one of these types. But a general note, in my opinion, as a tea drinker, and kind of doing a little bit of research on this, I would say that a pu'er tea is going to be a better bet if you're drinking more consistently throughout the day. Drinking a pu'er later at night is going to be a lot better and easier than drinking a red or a green, because all the caffeine, that is going to be difficult doing late night tea ceremonies, right? And so a pu'er tea is more subtle. It's a little bit more welcoming as a flavor as well as the response that you get physically, I should say, right? So those are all of your types of teas, all from the same plant. And actually, tea has kind of taken on this terminology of being an all-encompassing term when you start talking about your seeds or twigs or bark or your herbs or your dried fruits. All these different kinds of the flowers, all these different things are kind of classified as tea. But technically speaking, they're not. Technically, tea is from the tea tree, the Camellia sinensis. And everything else is actually an infusion, right? So you have like dandelion, chrysanthemum, chamomile for your kind of flowers. You've got your seeds like buckwheat, melon seeds. You've got dried fruit like orange peels. That's a very, very popular Chinese medical type of tea that is an infusion. Then you've got mixes that you've got people who put goji berries, red dates, ginger, ginseng, all these different kinds of things. There's many, many different ways to infuse your drink, but technically those are kind of additives or in some sense, Chinese medicine writ small and large. Lots of herbs that are steeped in hot water or added to certain mixtures to create formulas and combinations, but technically those aren't tea. Right, so there's kind of a semantic term that you have to be aware of there. When someone refers to buckwheat tea, for example, technically it's not tea, right? Technically, but in that sense, if we talk about that, there are exorbitant, just exponential number of teas if you include everything else. So we're going to focus on these tea from the specific tea shrub, this tree. Okay. Everything else has its place, and there's some things that we'll talk about in further episodes. I'd like to kind of get into some of those aspects of, what you can use, what herbs, what certain kinds of infusions are good for what cause, for what ailment. I think that there's a lot of subtleties that you can use, like buckwheat being good for the blood. It's very commonly drank with goji berry and things like that during the winter. Chamomile being kind of a sleep aid, chrysanthemum being more of a diuretic, roses being a little bit more soft in flavor for people with heart problems, but maybe a little bit too intense as a diuretic for drinking late at night. Like there's lots of aspects of these kinds of things that we can also get into. How like your ginseng is your immunity booster, your super infusion, right? But it can be a little bit overpowering, where sometimes the common substitute, I should say, that's maybe a little bit softer, easier on the body, but has that same kind of all-around kind of impact, would be like your huangjing, your golden, how do you pronounce that? The golden, I forget the name of it in English, but huangjing. Huangjing is kind of like a root that's dried off. You can eat it raw, you can steep it, you can boil it. Really, really good. King Solomon's root, I think is what it translates to. And so, yeah, there's lots of other types that I think those kind of fall more into the category of infusion or even Chinese medicine or herbology, like this kind of stuff. There's a huge variety of that, and that's definitely worth looking into. If you're drinking tea all the time, it's probably pretty common that you're also involved in, steeping dry fruit and like goji berries and dates and things like that, to add some variety to your experience, right? But for the tea ceremony, for what we do here, typically always loose leaf, different versions of that one tree. Okay. So you can see why even just narrowing it down to that one part, that one tree, even there you've got a huge amount of variety and taste. And then you've got all the branding on top of that. You got all the histories. You've got trees that can be harvested completely natural. You've got wild tree brands, which are probably most extravagant, maybe expensive type versions, but definitely the most kind of true to the roots, literally, of tea drinking. You've got those ones that are kind of like forest. They have like forest tree produced. So those are kind of like on the edges of the plantations. They might be lightly catered to and pruned, but they tend to be kind of on their own, but they're close enough to where, yeah, they're kind of maintained, I should say. Then you've got your kind of wild in the plantation, which, you have your plantation, but it's a naturally kind of organic thing in the mountains where it doesn't need to have these kind of pesticides, things like that. That's probably your most common and most kind of easily accessible and most consistently deliverable. And then you have kind of maybe your fully farmed, which is, completely manufactured, sprayed with pesticide, non-organic type stuff, which is definitely your just like cheap, average supermarket type, grab in a bag, it's ready to go. Probably not as strong of a taste. Probably, a little bit like super, super consistent, but, on some ways, maybe not as readily digestible or beneficial for the body. So those are kind of like the different ways. And just there alone, yeah, you have a huge amount of tea to choose from, right? So gone through that, and now you having a good idea of what you're drinking. You find yourself in the tea house, right? So now we can discuss, what do we do with the tea? What do we do? We have our pu'er, we have our red, we have our oolong. Now we're ready to drink, so we enter the tea house. First thing to talk about the tea house, I think, is really important, is just the overview, the imagery that's instilled, the balance that a tea ceremony, yes, but also just the tea house, just the tea table emphasizes, right? So we have the balancing of the 5 phases, right? So in Chinese, we have the mu hu tu jing shui. We have the wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. And these 5 are the transformative energies that kind of make up our tangible world, the relationships, the associations, the connections, right, that we make. It's transformative. So we'll get into this in a lot more detail in the future, but just know that each one gives into the other, right? We have wood, which burns, creates energy. That burn creates ash, which enriches the earth, the minerals. Those minerals condense and form rock, and form metal. And that metal filters out water, because the water washes off of it, like in the mountains. And that water returns to nurture the plant, right? So we have this generative cycle of these phases, sometimes referred to as the elements, but sometimes that can be wrongly associated with the water, fire, earth, air, these 4 kind of elements, these are more kind of definitive, like this is this, whereas the 5-phase cycle is a transformative cycle. It is energy going through a system, right? We'll come back to this a lot, but just understanding that on its kind of general perspective, the tea table is a reflection of that, is a microcosm of that system, right? So we have our wood, we have our plant, we have our kind of energy to nurture. We have our fire to release that energy, to begin that process of warming up everything. We have our earth, which is the table, which is the cups, is the vessel with which we can begin that cycle. We have our metal, which is the pot, which is the container, the bowl that we're heating up the water in. And of course, then we have the water, right? And we have that last element to combine everything together, right? So just in the tea table, the tea experience, we have this combination of these 5 phases, which creates the essential and balanced aspect of a tea ceremony, right? So there should be some kind of emphasis on that in some way. There's also a huge culture into going into each one of those, talking about your like the quality of the water. That's a big one in tea production. Traditionally the best type of water would be your stream or your kind of river water that's in constant flow. What would be the worst in some respects, if you look at like the classics of tea, actually would be spring water, which is probably what most people use now, is spring water. But they're really talking about like well water, where it's this very, very minerally, kind of very minerally rich water. Whereas that water, because it has so much in it, it has so much quality to it already, adding that to your tea kind of damages the experience, because it's actually kind of distinguishing, or it's lessening that distinguishing aspect, that distinction of those enzymes, of that fermentation process. All the work you put into creating this product, those minerals come in and clash with it, right? So spring and well water was really looked down upon traditionally, whereas river and stream water was the optimum situation for tea, to get to have the taste of the tree. To have the taste of the tree, of the tea, come out pure, right? And so there's a lot of discussion about this. You get into the quality of cups, your earthenware. There's clay, there's porcelain, there's metal, there's copper. There's many different ways that you can serve and prepare tea. There's many different types of pots. that you can do that in as well. The fire, the temperature of the fire, the temperature of the water that you're adding to the tea. Sometimes you'll have these written kind of directories of how much of a boil you want to get to before you add it to the leaves, how long it steeps, how many pours you do. All this stuff is very categorized in some families, in some kind of traditions, right? If it's boiled, what kind of boil? You have different types of identifying markers of the boil itself. So if you ever boil water, excuse me, if you ever boil water in a glass kettle, and you can see the initial soft bubbles, you have that kind of like the pearl dragon bubble, and that could be the bubble you need. That could be the boil you need to when you start pouring. It could be the rolling bubble. It could be the dragon roaring. It could be, these different aspects, these different periods. And there's lots of history in there that I'll try to find some of those resources and share, where you can identify the different types of boil, and how long that boil should be sustained, and how long you should rest before you pour. Like, all this stuff is categorized and planned out in some traditions. So those 5 phases can be pretty dense in information. It can be pretty widespread and inclusive, very, very, very intense process. Then you have your utensils. Over here, you've got your 7 utensils. You've got tongs. You've got the cup picker. You got the pu'er knife to cut things apart. You've got the preparation where you might put the tea out and kind of present it. You have your cups, of course. You have different types of pouring. So you have like your Gongfu cha, which has the side handle. You've got a gaiwan, which is like this. Oh, I've got one here as well. And so you've got the lidded cup, which doesn't have a handle. There's lots of different traditions on how you hold it, way it's served, how long the tea is inside. All that comes into play. The serving of tea itself can be a performance. It can be a ritual. It can be casual. It can be done for business. It can be done for friendship. It can be done for weddings, presenting your in-laws with a cup of tea. It can be done as a delegation. It can be done as part of a play. There are serious tea houses. There are casual tea houses. There are, markets. Everything in between you will find, right? So drinking tea can be a pretty big process, right? I think that it's good to try different ways. I'm very partial to gaiwan. I really like this setup. If you're on the video version, I have this gaiwan on top that automatically drains. That's probably not the most traditional. I think this might be frowned upon by some like tea aficionados, but I'm not a connoisseur. I am a hobbyist. I am a lover of tea, but not a fighter for the traditions. I'm willing to enjoy the taste and not worry so much about the way it was prepared. But if you're talking about a system like Gongfu cha, that's literally the skill of preparing tea, right? And so that will be an entire ritual. You'll have a tea tray, you'll have the table, have the small towel, the gaiwan, the Gongfu chawan, the pouring. I can't remember, what's that one called? Just the regular kettle with the handle, different sizes, different aged ones, different utensils, special cups, a gongbei, the pouring cup, everything, the strainer, everything is laid out. And then there are actual ceremonies done with tea, right? You could have this preparation performance, which is something that's done as like a presentation of the tea to make sure everything is done softly, quietly, smoothly, and very professional. And there are actually tea competitions to prepare tea. And so that is a whole practice on its own. You have things that are more natural, like chadao, which is your way of the tea, the translation of that. And that could center more around like a bowl drinking ceremony. So you would have your bowl, you would drink large amounts, followed by a ritual meditation practice. And you might drink 9 cups. And during those bowls, you might drink 9 bowls. And during that process, you're going through a specific kind of, even a qigong practice, a meditation practice. You're kind of brought through this experience by a guide, by your host, who might give you cues, who might, read scripture, might sing poems, might play music. There's quite a lot of variety there as well. So tea ceremonies can be pretty widespread as far as how they're employed. I think the most common is probably Gongfu cha, because there's a little bit of kind of a principle, right? Like the way you lay cups out, if you have a certain number of cups, they should be laid out in a way that doesn't disregard anyone, and it doesn't direct the attention towards anyone specifically. So if there's 3 cups, they're done in a triangle, not in a line. That way everyone's equal. There's no one in the center. If there's 2 cups, they might be done directly in front of each other, so it's kind of a mutual exchange. There's different shapes depending on how many people. You typically serve a specific direction. There is a certain way to serve. There is a certain way to receive, right? With the emphasis always being on the tea being either focus of that event. In the case of a chadao, in the case of a bowl drinking ceremony, it's kind of the way you're bringing the attention to the sensation of drinking tea, of the practice and the ritual of it, or the focus is removed from it and it should be a background. Whereas probably what people are doing when they're having tea drinking, they're not really having a ceremony, they're having tea drinking. And that might just be you're doing everything professionally in a way that doesn't clash with your event, right? So you're preparing tea quietly and subtly and always serving, never letting anyone kind of go without tea. So that way the conversation can continue. You're not smashing the teacups together. Everything's very soft. Everything's very kind of beatific and subtle. And so there's a certain motion, there's a certain way to carry. The kettle cannot be facing the guest. The mouth of the kettle cannot be facing the guest because that's kind of seen as impolite. You don't overfill a cup because that's seen as impolite. It could be, whereas if it's alcohol, you want to overfill it because that shows that you really like this person. With tea, you don't overfill, you fill to a certain level for everybody. So that way it shows that this kind of care has been taken for you. So there's always this kind of, depending on what kind of ceremony you're involved in, kind of what kind of practice you're trying to put forth, what kind of environment you're trying to instill, that is kind of dependent on the ceremony, right? So I would say that I don't do a lot of ceremony. I do know this system, and I've done a little bit for some people, and when we're trying to have that more kind of intimate practice. But generally speaking, I drink tea. So we serve tea, we have tea, and we kind of commune around the table, right? This is just the centerpiece, right? There are a few other small things. So one of the really great things that you should know, maybe the easiest etiquette that I can explain quickly, is the way of saying thanks, the way of saying that you appreciate this cup, for example, right? And what that'll be is it'll either be, in some cases, a flat hand next to the cup as they pour. You never really want to pick the cup up and hold it out as they pour. That's a little bit overeager, and also you risk burning yourself. And it's a common thing because it seems polite when someone's pouring you to kind of, bring the cup to them, which is polite. I mean, the cup should be close enough to your host that they don't really have to lean or brace over the table to give you more tea. So it should be placed closer if you want more, but you don't necessarily need to hold it out for them. That's kind of because they're just unsure of the ceremony. If the cup is close enough for them to pour, as they pour, you want to acknowledge that, right? Some cases that might just be an open palm next to the cup to kind of nod of thanks to your host, right? But what's more common and what will really get you in with the Chinese community is if you take 2 fingers and you either tap next to the cup or you take the knuckles and you rock, right? I think tapping is the kind of modern custom right now. But what it stems from, actually, the story goes that at some point, tea culture, of course, is always a big practice and really widely done. You might go to the tea house to get information, have business deals, see a performance, meet with friends, have dinner. Everything revolves in some way or includes tea, right? And so the idea is that the king, the emperor, historically was out. I don't remember the exact dynasty where the story comes from, but he was out in public trying to maintain his privacy, whether it was escaping from the enemy or just trying to be out in town. I'm not quite exactly sure on, but the idea was that he didn't want his generals, his soldiers, his bodyguards giving away his position. And so no one could bow to him. No one could koto. No one could say thanks. No one could use his title in public because they didn't want to give away his privacy. And so when he would serve them or when he would sit with them, the way of saying thanks became this rocking of the knuckles, the index finger and the middle finger specifically, I think, in the sense of this is representative of me bowing to you because I'm not allowed to do it completely. I will emulate that with my hand. And that became tapping, and that became the custom of saying thanks in tea ceremony. And I really love this. It's very simple and very subtle. And the great thing about it is it doesn't disrupt the practice. It's an etiquette that is really, really true to the tea ceremony. Is very essential in some way because it doesn't distract from the ceremony, right? Sometimes that you're having a conversation and someone's pouring you a cup and you stop everything to express your politeness, to preserve that etiquette, and it becomes almost disruptive to the process, right? Because it's too abrupt. Whereas during a conversation, as your host pours you a cup, you can lightly tap a few times next to the cup, and that is an acknowledgement, and it is a courteous kind of experience, a courteous exchange between host and guest that really ingrains you, but also I think it's very, it's not essential, but it very much kind of emphasizes the ideal that you're trying to align with. So next time you're having tea with someone and you lightly tap next to them, that's just to show your appreciation. And that is maybe like the best etiquette. Rather everything else is more common sense. Filling cups, pouring a certain way, not reaching over your cup or someone else's cup, maintaining the directions of things towards a neutral place. Creating an environment that is enriching. That is the most important thing. Whether you're having a ceremony or just having tea with some friends. One other thing that I do want to share with you is there are some special items on the table, and I want to share with you my favorite one because you could have a lot of ornaments. I talked about this in a few one of the early episodes. I think the first one actually, talking about kind of the layout of the tea room, of the tea experience, how it should kind of be subtle, maybe earthy tones, something that's warm and inviting, but not abrupt in the sense that it's trying to kind of show off your prestige or show off your accolades in some way. It's something that's meant to be natural, a kind of intimate experience, right? And so the ornamentation is very simple, right? You have something that maybe people recognize that as a conversation starter. You have something that's earthy, natural, something that is related to art in this way. But you might also have a single ornament, maybe a few in some cases. This is all up to you. But you'll often recognize a single ornament, which I don't have one here. Right now I have, if you've noticed over here, I do have my tea friend over here. So on the video version, you can see this. If you're listening on podcast, you can't. I have a small porcelain sculpture to my side of a tea connoisseur. This is actually, I forget his name right now. He is the author of the classic of tea, Louis. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but he is kind of the philosopher who kind of writ into kind of the standard tea etiquette, right? So he's kind of my friend. He's my partner here for every episode, having his tea cup and his book, and kind of paying attention to the conversation, hopefully. This is maybe just a little bit more ornamental, but you'll often notice something like this that's on the tea table itself. And that's something that when you serve tea, if you're serving loose leaf tea that's been packaged and caked or bricked or something, the first pour, the first cup of tea is often kind of unusable. It's often just the wash the tea. It's the first pour that's a little bit too strong. It's not quite balanced yet. And so it can be a little bit more astringent. It can be just kind of a way you need to wash the leaves off and then prepare the tea as well. You need to open everything up. And so that first cup of tea might actually be poured out. It might be, in a sense, it's a tribute. It's an offering to the ancestors or to this experience. It's kind of just an opening ritual. And so what will happen is that ornament on the table, often you'll take that first pour of tea and you'll cleanse that ornament. And the idea is that over time, it develops a patina. It develops kind of a hue. It ages. As you'll see, a lot of ceramic cups that are used for a specific type of tea, over the years, they kind of enrich themselves and become darker and become aged. And for a teacup, that can actually influence and elevate the quality of the tea, right? That patina, that aging of it, kind of like a cast iron pot, right? But for this, it's ornamental. So I think with time, you'll notice like those ornaments get darker and they get like this kind of nice, kind of antique look to them. And that is something that can be really essential to a tea ceremony, kind of that ritual of pouring the first cup out. One of my favorite ones, you can have many different ornaments. It could be something special to the culture, something special to you. There's many, many different replicas. Some of them are like everything from like babies peeing. There's a tradition of these ornaments that you pour over, and as you pour over, the water goes in and is urinated out, which is a funny tradition. It could be animals. It could be the zodiac. It could be just an ornate design. It could be something musical. There's a very famous Guqin sculpture. There's many different things it could be. One of the most famous ones is called the Jinchan, which is the golden frog, right? And you'll notice this frog, he's very, very popular, almost as popular as the waving cat that you see all the time. But he's often a frog, sometimes on a pile of coins, sometimes not, and sometimes with a coin in his mouth. But the most distinguishing feature is he will have 3 legs. He has only 1 leg in the back, 2 legs in front and a center leg in the back. Sometimes adorned with jewels, different designs as well. There's a few different stories of the legend of this frog and kind of what it means. But the most basic, simple story is that at some point there was this frog, this magical frog that was terrorizing people and causing mischief and pain and just all over chaos. And there was this Taoist immortal from Ludongbing called Liu Hai. And Liu Hai helped the people and defeated this frog. And in some of the stories, he actually cuts off one of his legs. And that's how he starts winning this fight with this magical frog. And at the end, Liu Hai shows him mercy and is not going to kill the frog. And the frog is so kind of shooken out of his rage that he becomes a disciple to Liu Hai, and his, not punishment, but his kind of, the way he turns everything around is by setting off to enrich everyone's life and help them find treasure and good fortune and bring wealth to all the people. Kind of his penance, but also because he's shown how Liu Hai is such a virtuous person that he finally kind of awakes and finds his true goal. And so now, for all history, for all eternity, that's his task of bringing good fortune to everybody. And so you'll notice this frog, and I gave them away as gifts. I'm thinking about getting another one of Jinchan on the tea table or whatever ornament it might be. My first tea ceremony, really, I fell in love with this item because the first cup of tea, when they poured it over Jinhan, when they poured it over this frog with money that I saw, he went from a dark color to bright gold. And they make some of these out of a special stone or out of a special material that when you pour hot water, hot liquid over it, it changes color, kind of like a mood ring, right? And so in this ornament, as you would pour water over it, it looked from this like bronze looking kind of earth tone frog to a bright gold color while it was hot. And I have a few of those back in the States. I've given a few of his gifts. They're very, very common to give to people as like a good fortune, an omen. But there also has to be some care taken with it, right? You have to orient it in a certain way. You're not supposed to have them facing doors or windows, especially when you're not at the tea table or during the night, because he's the bringer of fortune. And so you want to make sure that fortune is maintained. You can't just show it off. You can't just let it go outward. If it's facing a door or a window, that means you're going to lose fortune, right? The frog will kind of send it that way. And so there, the orientation of some of these items also very much matters. Kind of like the orientation of the pot. The kettle shouldn't be pointed at your guest. These kinds of things. So that's one of my favorite ornaments. But there's very, very, very many of them. All ways to kind of bring an extra piece of expression to the ceremony. So yeah, that is kind of the whole tea ceremony. From there, I think personally, the most important thing is to enjoy. There are many, many things to try, many, many ways to experience, and there's no real best answer on, what is the best, because that is the art of tea. That is the expression. That is the whole reason it's part of the culture so much, because it's not necessarily this is the best. It's very much so that you need to find that piece of it that's attuned to you, that piece that benefits you. And most likely with tea, that's going to change. And so the spice of life is variety, right? I would say try different things. I would say find different markets and experience different teas. And once you get into the culture, like I think now for me, it's very common knowledge here that I'm a tea drinker, and that becomes the gift. That becomes the way people exchange pleasantries. And that only enriches the experience. It only gives you more varieties to taste. It only gives you more things to try. And so you create a whole nother aspect of your relationships with tea, because it's a way that you can invite someone in, you can get to know them, you can share personal things about yourself and together in a way that seems very natural. It's the breaking of bread. It's the breaking of bread in China. It's that way of opening the door to our inner selves. That could mean meditation. That could mean a social gathering. That could mean the opening for a musical event, In a lot of cases these are all commonly used. And there's nothing like a warm cup of tea to welcome everybody, right? No matter what you're experiencing, the care taken in that preparation is something that even if you aren't aware of all the steps it takes, it's something that feels naturally attuned. It feels like something that is preserved and delivered to you. And when it's received, you can feel the care that's went into it. And creating that undisturbed process is the tea ceremony. So I'd like to leave you with a few things, because of course I can't go into everything. I hope we continue talking about this, and I will continue to share tea types with you and varieties and stories. And this is our center. This is where we start from. But there are many, many different resources. To name a few, some of the books that I've read that I own and I've referenced a bit are there is a book called All the Tea in China by Wang Jian, and another one, The Ancient Art of Tea by Warren Peltier. These two books available on Amazon, wherever you want to find them. I'm sure they're very popular as well. These books are really nice because they go into some of that history, the etiquette, the poetry, the art, but also some of the details of preparation, some of the different traditions, some of the different kind of guidelines and rules that you should use. And I think that's a good place to start, but I can't emphasize enough the importance of just trying, of doing different things, and not just pouring tea in a cup and leaving it there all day until it gets cold, and it gets warm, and it gets cold, but really trying to embrace the process and invest into it. Not just financially, but I mean, consciously, be aware of the practice, be aware of your guests, be aware of the difference between cup to cup. Each tea ceremony can teach us something new. The bowl ceremony, the meditation ceremony, the chadao can teach us about the sensation, the fullness of tea, the aroma, the sensation, the feeling, the energy of qi, the energy of tea. The Gongfu cha can teach us about the principle and the etiquette and the system and the process itself. And drinking tea with friends, family, social gatherings, business events, performances, parties, can help you to strengthen that connection. And hopefully you get to share a passion of yours. You get to share your expression of tea, which is an expression of yourself, essentially. The way you maintain the experience, the way you deliver, is very much a reflection of the balance of yourself. One more recommendation. If you haven't seen the movie Fearless, every moment of it is definitely worth it. There's an especially good quote from it about tea. And the main character, Ho Yuanjia, played by Jet Li, is asked about the grade of tea, what makes the best tea. Of course, this is an undertone for the comparison of martial arts and systems of thought. But what he goes on to say is the famous quote, "Tea is tea." The way he sees it, tea does not judge itself. That is a system that we have created. We judge tea. And while it may be true that you can say one is better than the other, for him it's irrelevant. Because when you're in a good mood, the tea is good. If you're happy, tea tastes good. And so it is more about the practice, the cultivation, the experience of the individual, rather than choosing the best or being the best. And so I definitely agree with that. I really think that the more we can kind of emulate that process of how much preparation, how much cultivation and awareness and consciousness that's put into the production of tea, if we can emulate that just a little bit in our own lives, then we find some natural roots. We find our sweet spot. We're able to express ourselves in the most enriching way, the most tasteful way. So I will leave you with that. I think that finding the right tea is a journey. The destination is at the end and the bottom of your next cup. And hopefully we keep finding empty cups and balanced hearts. So Here's to emptying our cups. Ganbei. Thank you for tuning into today's episode. Subscribe and join me every Tuesday for new episode releases, also available wherever you get your podcasts. Support the Ways of Wudang through Patreon and get access to resources, classes, and more. Keep the conversation going with hashtag Talks-Unfiltered or connect with me directly by joining the Ways of Wudang on Discord. Links are in the description. I'll talk with you next time for another cup of tea. Thank you for listening to this Tea Talk. Be sure to subscribe and join me every Tuesday for new episode releases, available wherever you get your podcasts. You can also view the video version of this podcast on YouTube and support the Ways of Wudang through Patreon. Keep the conversation going with hashtag Talks-Unfiltered or connect with me directly by joining the Ways of Wudang on Discord. I'll talk with you next week for another cup of tea.